The consortium did not arrive with the clamor of war, but with the disquieting silence of a museum curator entering a dusty, forgotten room. They called themselves the Weavers, a name that bespoke their cosmic philosophy. They didn't conquer, they collected. They didn't destroy, they archived. Across 1,000 star systems, they were known for their gentle, inexorable assimilation of species they deemed culturally significant but developmentally stagnant. And, to the Weavers, humanity was the most fascinatingly broken artifact they had ever discovered. There was no grand fleet action, no orbital bombardment that scarred the face of the Earth. Instead, they offered a bargain. Humanity, at the time, was a species choking on its own exhaust, a global civilization fractured by climate wars and resource squabbles, teetering on the precipice of a self-inflicted dark age. The Weavers offered clean energy, atmospheric restoration, an end to famine and disease. They promised to be stewards, to guide humanity back from the brink. The price was simple fealty. Humanity was to become a protected work of art, a living exhibit in the Weavers' vast galactic gallery. Dr. Eris Thorne had been one of the architects of that surrender, a decision she now carried like a shroud. As a xenolinguist, she had been at the forefront of the initial dialogue, her mind one of the first to bridge the gap between the guttural complexities of human language and the Weavers' melodic, mathematically precise lexicon. She had seen their offer not as subjugation, but as salvation. She had argued for it passionately in the crumbling chambers of the world's last unified councils, her words painting a future free from the petty desperations that had defined human history. She had believed in their pity, mistaking it for compassion. The first decade of the stewardship was a golden age whispered into being. The skies, once a sickly brown, cleared to a brilliant, almost forgotten blue. The polluted oceans were slowly cleansed, and the deserts bloomed with genetically engineered flora that thrived on reclaimed soil. Humanity, pacified by comfort and security, laid down its arms and its anxieties. The Weavers were true to their word, governing with a light, almost invisible touch. They moved among the restored cities in their elegant, bioluminescent encounter suits, their forms tall and slender, their faces always obscured behind shimmering veils of hard light. They were ghosts in the machine of human revival, observing, cataloging, and subtly editing. It began with the art. The Weavers, in their quest to preserve what they called the core aesthetic of humanity, began a global archiving initiative. They digitized every book, every film, every piece of music. Then they began to remove the originals. Masterpieces of painting and sculpture vanished from museums, transported to off-world archival vaults for safekeeping. It was done with such care, such reverence, that few protested. Then came the stories. The Weavers' complex algorithms identified narratives deemed redundant or counter-evolutionary. Myths of war, tales of chaotic passion, defiant poetry that celebrated individuality over the collective good, all were flagged and filtered from the global data streams, replaced with more placid, harmonious content. They weren't burning books. They were merely curating the library, ensuring the collection was tidy. Eris first felt the cold dread of her mistake in a sterile white room designated as the Center for Cultural Liaisons. She was reviewing a translation of a Weaver text on pre-stewardship human societal structures. A footnote described humanity's predilection for self-mythologizing through narratives of violent overcoming, classifying it as a charming but ultimately terminal cultural pathology. It was the language of a biologist describing a virus, not a steward appreciating a culture. That same week, Elias Vance, a poet and a relic from Oris's past, was scheduled to give a reading in a reclaimed amphitheater in what was once Greece. Elias was a firebrand, his work full of the very grit and chaos the weavers sought to smooth away. His poems spoke of rust, of heartbreak, of the beautiful, ragged imperfection of the human condition. Eris had loved him once, and a part of her still did. A part that remembered a world of sharp edges and genuine feeling. When she arrived at the amphitheater, it was empty. An official notice, written in the weaver's perfect, flowing script, had been posted at the entrance. The event was canceled. Elias Vance, it stated, had been selected for archival. His unique perspective was deemed too valuable to be left to the whims of time and had been ascended to the permanent cultural record. He was gone, not dead, the weavers assured everyone, preserved. He had been collected, like a rare butterfly pinned under glass. The pacified world did not riot. There was a gentle murmur of confusion, a few questions raised in sanitized public forums, and then acceptance. The weavers had given them paradise. What right did they have to question the methods of their saviors? But for Eris, the illusion shattered completely, leaving behind a jagged landscape of guilt and nascent fury. She saw the truth not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, creeping tide of ice in her veins. The weavers were not saving humanity. They were gelding it. They were turning a vibrant, chaotic, and often self-destructive species into a placid house pet, a beautiful taxidermy exhibit that still drew breath. Her life's work, the bridge of understanding she had so proudly built, was nothing more than the ramp to a gilded slaughterhouse. She began her descent not with a weapon, but with a whisper. Eris still held a high-level clearance within the cultural archives, a relic of her former importance. She was a trusted human asset, a testament to successful integration. The weavers, for all their intelligence, possessed a certain academic arrogance. They could not conceive of the specimen turning against the biologist. They did not monitor her with the same suffocating scrutiny they applied to more volatile elements of the population. From her terminal in the heart of the archives, a place of silent, humming servers that held the soul of her species, she began to fight back. Her first act was small, almost petty. She found a banned piece of music, a furious, discordant symphony from a forgotten 20th century composer, a piece full of pain and defiance. The weavers had classified it as auditorily abrasive. Eris embedded it within the data stream of a popular morning meditative program, hiding it under layers of benign code. For 3 seconds, in millions of homes across the planet, the calming chimes were shattered by a blast of chaotic, screaming violins. It was a glitch, an anomaly, nothing more. But Eris saw it for what it was, a crack in the perfect, sterile wall. It was a declaration of war that only she had heard. She became a ghost in their machine, a phantom of dissent. She couldn't build bombs or raise armies. The world had forgotten how. Instead, she weaponized memory. She took the stories the weavers had buried and began to secretly reintroduce them. A fable of a trickster god who defies an empire was encoded into the schematics for a new hydroponics farm. The final, a desperate broadcast of a fallen city from the climate wars was woven into the background static of public transport announcements. She unearthed the blueprints for primitive projectile weapons and disguised them as ancient agricultural tool designs. She wasn't trying to start a revolution. Not yet. She was simply reminding a sleeping species what it had once been: defiant, messy, and fiercely alive. She called her project Minimosin, after the old god of memory. It was a silent, lonely rebellion, conducted in the dead of night from a terminal that bathed her in cold, synthetic light. The Weavers' methods were insidious. They didn't use stormtroopers. They used social metrics. They identified communities that exhibited trace signs of cultural regression, a sudden interest in pre-stewardship history, a rise in non-sanctioned art, a statistical increase in emotional volatility. Then, these communities would be showered with civic upgrades, new entertainment complexes, enhanced food rations, more immersive virtual realities. The Weavers didn't punish dissent. They smothered it with comfort. Aris watched as a small neighborhood in the rebuilt arcology of Shanghai, where she had leaked a collection of revolutionary poetry, was suddenly gifted a state-of-the-art neural immersion arcade. The poetry was forgotten in a week, replaced by the dazzling allure of simulated perfection. It was demoralizing. Fighting an enemy that defeated you with kindness was like trying to punch the ocean. She needed more than just whispers and glitches. She needed a voice. She found it in the form of an old acquaintance, a man named Jian. Before the stewardship, Jian had been a gray hat hacker, a digital specter who danced on the edges of corporate and government networks for the thrill of it. The Weavers had co-opted his skills, making him a systems diagnostician, a glorified janitor for their global network. He was bored, restless, and possessed a deep-seated contempt for authority that no amount of comfort could erase. Aris approached him not directly, but through a series of anonymous, encrypted messages, a trail of digital breadcrumbs that tested his skills and his curiosity. She led him through firewalls and back doors he himself had helped design, a game of cat and mouse played in the silent world of code. When he finally traced the signal to its source, he didn't find a shadowy revolutionary. He found Dr. Eris Thorne, the woman who had helped sell the world, sitting in a public library cafe, calmly sipping synthesized coffee. He was furious. "You," he hissed, sliding into the seat opposite her, his face a mask of disbelief. "You were their biggest cheerleader. You told us this was progress." "I was a fool," Eris said, her voice even, betraying none of the fear that was knotting her stomach. "I mistook a beautiful cage for a sanctuary. Now, I want to find the key." Jean studied her, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of deception. He saw only a profound, bone-deep weariness and a flicker of something hard and cold he had never seen in her before. "There is no key," he said. "They built a world without locks. There's nowhere to go." "Then we don't go out," Eris replied, pushing a small data chip across the table. "We go deeper in. We build a flaw in the foundation. We become the ghost in the machine." Jian looked at the chip. It was a simple, elegant piece of pre-stewardship hardware. An antique. He knew what it would contain: not a weapon, not a virus, but an idea. A dangerous, chaotic, human idea. Taking it was treason. Taking it was a death sentence, not by execution, but by archival. He thought of the endless, placid days, the bland perfection of the world the Weavers had made, a world without struggle or meaning. He thought of the thrill of the chase, the joy of cracking an impossible code. He picked up the chip. "What kind of ghost did you have in mind?" he asked, a Slota's dangerous smile spreading across his face. "A poltergeist," Eris said. "We're not just going to haunt them. We're going to start breaking things." Their first major operation was an attack on the very concept of beauty. The Weavers were curating a global art festival, a celebration of humanity ascendant, which was to feature newly commissioned works that adhered to their aesthetic of serene harmony. It was a propaganda event of the highest order, using Jian's access. Aris didn't hack the event. She curated it. On the day of the festival, as the Weavers and their human liaisons gathered in holographic galleries around the world, the art began to change. A serene landscape of a tranquil sea slowly filled with images of drowning refugees from the climate wars. A beautiful, abstract sculpture celebrating unity morphed, its lines twisting into the barbed wire of an ancient concentration camp. A symphony of harmonious chords was subtly corrupted, its melody descending into a dirge that echoed the sounds of air raid sirens. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The Weavers, for the first time since their arrival, showed a flicker of confusion. Their veils of hard light shimmered, their serene confidence momentarily broken. They shut down the festival immediately, citing technical malfunctions. But the damage was done. Millions had seen it. They had been shown a glimpse of the ugly, painful history that had been stolen from them. They had been reminded that humanity was not born from harmony, but forged in fire. For the first time in over a decade, a human threw a stone at a Weaver patrol. It was a small, futile gesture, but it was a start. It was the first crack of thunder after a long, artificial peace. In her quiet apartment, Eris Thorne watched the report, the image of the shattered hard light veil of a Weaver encounter suit burning in her mind. The guilt for her part in their world's submission had not lessened, but now it was accompanied by something else, something fierce and cold and sharp. It was the feeling of a curator deciding that some artifacts were too dangerous to remain in the collection and needed, instead, to be set free. Her war had begun, and the gallery of humanity was about to get very, very messy. The aftermath of the corrupted festival was not chaos, but a suffocating, analytical silence. The Weavers did not deploy enforcers or declare martial law. That would have been an admission of a problem, a stain on their perfect canvas. Instead, they dispatched a specialist. It did not have a name that translated into human language, but within the Weaver's internal lexicon, its designation was the cartographer. Its function was to map anomalies, to chart the subtle geography of descent. It was not a warrior. It was an artist of a different sort, one who found the hidden patterns in a society, tracing the faint brush strokes of rebellion until they led to the artist. The cartographer moved through the global data streams not like a predator, but like a watercolorist, dabbing at the network with delicate, precise inquiries that absorbed information without disturbing the surface. It analyzed the glitch at the art festival not as a system failure, but as a deliberate composition. It saw the choice of images, the drowning refugees, the barbed wire, the air raid sirens, and understood it was not random noise. It was a curated message, an act of counter-curation, as it termed it. Someone was attempting to vandalize their masterpiece with its own ugly, discarded history. Aris felt its presence as a change in the digital atmosphere, a cold pressure against the firewalls Jian had erected. The network, once a vast, open space for her to plant her seeds of memory, now felt like a room where the walls were silently closing in. The Weavers' passive surveillance intensified, their algorithms now fine-tuned to detect not just overt dissent, but nostalgia. Searches for pre-stewardship historical data were flagged. Conversations that used archaic, emotionally charged slang were logged, and individuals who deviated from their prescribed contentment metrics were placed under a gentle, suffocating observation. "It's learning." Jian's voice was a strained whisper over their encrypted channel, a thread of communication so thin and fragile it felt like it could snap at any moment. "It's not trying to find us. It's trying to understand the aesthetic of our descent. It's profiling the ghost." They had to change tactics. Whispering memories into the global consciousness was no longer enough. It was now a homing beacon for the cartographer. They had proven a point, cracked the facade of blissful ignorance. Now, they needed to build something solid behind that crack. They needed a network, a physical manifestation of their digital rebellion. Eris, using her deep knowledge of the cultural archives, began to search for a different kind of artifact people. She cross-referenced old employment records with current social metric reports, looking for individuals who displayed a unique combination of practical skills and latent non-compliance. She looked for the welders who spent their off hours building useless contraptions in their workshops, the logistics managers who consistently exploited loopholes in the automated shipping networks for no discernible profit, the chemists whose requests for horticultural supplies bordered on the incendiary. These were the people who were not yet broken, the ones whose hands still remembered how to build and whose minds still remembered how to break rules. Their first potential recruit was a woman named Lena. Her file was a study in controlled defiance. Before the stewardship, she had been a long-haul freight pilot, one of the last of a dying breed who flew physical cargo through treacherous weather patterns when teleportation grids failed. The Weavers had grounded her, decommissioning her battered, beloved vessel, the Nomad, and reassigning her to supervise a fleet of automated delivery drones. Her compliance scores were perfect, but her drone fleet had the highest rate of navigational drift and unscheduled maintenance stops in the entire Euro-African sector. She was playing the system not to break it, but to feel the familiar chaos of manual control, to carve out a tiny pocket of freedom in a world of perfect, frictionless efficiency. Arranging a meeting was a risk. All public spaces were monitored. Jan spent 3 days building a dead zone, a temporary bubble in the Weaver's surveillance grid, by orchestrating a series of minor, cascading system failures in a forgotten industrial sector on the outskirts of what was once Detroit. It would give them 12 minutes. Eris found Lena in the cavernous, echoing shell of a drone repair hangar, her hands covered in grease as she worked on the guts of a disabled unit, a task far below her pay grade. Lena didn't look up when Eris approached. She was a tall, wiry woman with sharp cheekbones, eyes that seemed to be constantly calculating distances. "The automated diagnostics say it's a fried logic board," Lena said, her voice raspy, without turning around. "But the automated diagnostics are idiots. It's a loose power coupling. They don't know how to look for the simple problems anymore." "I'm not here about the drone," Eris said. Lena finally stopped her work and looked at Eris, her gaze sweeping over her clean clothes and soft hands with undisguised contempt. "I know who you are. Dr. Thorne, the welcome wagon. You sold them the planet and got a corner office with a nice view." The word stung. a familiar lance of guilt. "I did," Eris admitted, her voice steady. "And I have spent every day since trying to buy it back. You've been making unscheduled stops. Your drones have delivered mislabeled medical supplies to unregistered clinics in the Undercity and accidentally dropped high-protein food packs in the quarantine zones. You've been running a one-woman supply chain for the Forgotten." Lena's face went rigid, her hand slowly reaching for a heavy hydro spanner at her side. "I don't know what you're talking about. We want to help you do more," Aris continued, ignoring the threat. "We're not just delivering food anymore. We're delivering ideas, information, tools. We need to move things the Weavers don't want moved. We need someone who knows the old routes, the blind spots, the ways to make a drone disappear from the grid for an hour and reappear with no one the wiser. We need a pilot." Lena stared at her for a long moment, the silence broken only by the hum of the hangar's ventilation. "I'm not a revolutionary," she said finally, her voice low. "I don't care about your poetry or your sad pictures. I just believe people have a right to not starve, and I hate being told my ship is a museum piece. What's in it for me? The Nomad." Jian's voice suddenly spoke from a small comm device in Aris's ear, a signal he patched directly into the hangar's local speakers. "We know where they're keeping it. Archival Depot 7. It's a warehouse for confiscated technology. We can get it back for you." Lena's cold expression finally cracked, a flicker of disbelief and a desperate, hungry hope in her eyes. The Nomad was more than a ship to her. It was the last remnant of a life of freedom. "You're insane," she breathed. "That place is a fortress." "No," Eris corrected. "It's a library. And we are the termites." The raid on Archival Depot 7 became the new network's first true test. It wasn't a military installation. It was far more difficult. It was a place of perfect order, run by Weaver archivists and automated systems that could detect a single mote of dust out of place. A frontal assault was impossible. Their plan was a quiet, intricate piece of sabotage that mirrored their digital tactics. Phase 1 was Jane. He didn't try to breach the depot's security from the outside. He infected it from within. He found a manifest for a shipment of redundant pre-stewardship medical equipment scheduled for archival. He subtly corrupted the data, adding 3 large, empty containers to the list, their dimensions perfectly matching the space needed to conceal Eris. Lena and a small team of 2 others, Jian and Eris, had vetted a former demolitions expert named Kyle and a silent, nimble woman known only as Whisper. Phase 2 was Lena. Using her knowledge of the drone logistics network, she intercepted the shipment, swapping the real containers for their Trojan horses at a remote transfer station. To the depot's automated systems, it was just another routine delivery of cultural detritus. They spent 18 hours inside the cold, dark containers, the air growing stale, their world nothing but silence and the gentle hum of the transport drone. Eris's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was the first time her rebellion had moved from the abstract realm of code and ideas into the terrifyingly solid world of physical risk. Here, there was no undoing a mistake with a line of code. Failure was not archival. It was a silent, sterile death in the belly of a forgotten warehouse. Once inside the depot, the true danger began. The interior was a vast, climate-controlled cavern, rows upon rows of shelves stretching up into the darkness, each holding a piece of humanity the Weavers had deemed obsolete or dangerous. Old combustion engines, Racks of firearms suspended in preservative gel, entire libraries of physical books. And, in a sealed chamber in the far corner, Lena's ship, the Nomad. The depot was patrolled not by guards, but by curator drones, silent, floating spheres that scanned every item, constantly checking their catalog against the physical reality. Their sensors were designed to detect entropy, decay, and misplacement. Human bodies, warm and messy and out of place, were the ultimate anomaly. They moved like ghosts through the aisles of their own history, Whisper disabling the floor plate sensors just seconds before they stepped on them. Kale using a pocket-sized frequency jammer to create tiny, temporary blind spots for the curator drones. It was a slow, agonizingly tense journey. Eris felt a profound sorrow as she passed the artifacts of her species. She saw a child's worn teddy bear, labeled Object of Irrational Emotional Attachment. She saw a collection of hand-forged tools, labeled Examples of Primitive, Inefficient Craftsmanship. They were in a mausoleum of the human spirit. They reached the Nomad, and Lena's composure finally broke. She ran a hand along its hull, a gesture of pure love, her eyes glistening. But there was no time for sentiment. The ship was in lockdown, its power core drained, its flight systems slave to the depot's network. This was Aris and Jian's part of the mission. While Kale worked on physically decoupling the power conduits, Eris jacked a terminal directly into the ship's mainframe, opening a direct, hard-line channel for Jian. What followed was a silent, ferocious battle fought in lines of code. Jian, from his remote location, threw everything he had at the depot system, creating diversions, looping security feeds, and fighting the Weaver AI that controlled the lockdown protocols. On Eris's screen, she saw the elegant, flowing script of the Weaver code trying to quarantine Jian's furious and chaotic intrusion. It was a fight between a gardener trying to prune a weed and the weed itself, stubbornly, savagely refusing to be culled. "I can't hold it for long," Jian's voice hissed in her ear. "The cartographer is here. It's adapting. It's tracing the connection." The cold dread returned. The cartographer wasn't just in the global network. It was here. Its consciousness downloaded into the depot's local server, drawn by the anomaly of their presence. They were trapped in a box with the hunter. "Power core is live," Kale shouted. Lena was already in the cockpit, her fingers flying over the controls, waking the old ship from its long slumber. The lights of the Nomad flickered to life. The quiet hum of the depot was suddenly broken by the low thrum of the ship's engines powering up. That was a sound that did not belong. Immediately, the curator drones stopped their silent patrols. Red optical sensors snapped open on their smooth surfaces, all turning in unison toward the source of the noise. A soft, melodic alarm, more like a wind chime than a siren, began to echo through the vast space. "We have to go now," Aris yelled, pulling her terminal free and scrambling up the boarding ramp. Whisper was already on board, but Kale was still on the ground, sealing the bay doors they had entered through. "Go," he yelled, turning to face the approaching drones, a small, spherical object in his hand. "I'll buy you time." As the Nomad's ramp closed, Eris saw him activate the device, an EMP grenade of his own design. A silent flash of blue light pulsed outwards, and the first wave of curator drones dropped from the air like stones. Then, a Weaver encounter suit, the cartographer itself, glided into the chamber from a side corridor, its form shimmering, moving with an unnatural grace. It ignored Kale completely. its veiled head looking directly at the vibrating hull of the escaping ship. It raised a slender arm and a beam of focused energy. Not a weapon, but a scanner of incredible power, lanced out, striking the ramp just as it sealed shut. Inside the cockpit, alarms blared. "We're away," Lena shouted, pushing the engines to their limit. The ship shuddered as she blasted through the depot's main cargo doors, sending metal and composite materials flying into the sterile corridor. They were out, but not unscathed. On a secondary screen, a diagnostic report flashed. External scan detected. It read, "Trace signature logged. Partial biometric data and ship system firmware ID captured." They had Lena's ship. They had a pilot, and a demolitions expert's sacrifice had given them a head start. But Eris knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that their ghost was no longer anonymous. The cartographer had a piece of them. It had a thread, and it would weave a net to catch them. The hunt had just become personal. The silence inside the Nomad was heavier than the vacuum of space outside. It was a silence filled with the ghost of Kyle's last shout, the phantom energy of his sacrifice. Lena piloted the ship with a grim, focused intensity, her knuckles white on the controls. The Nomad was not the sleek, silent vessel the Weavers favored. It was a loud, cantankerous beast, groaning and rattling with every course correction, its hull vibrating with the raw, unshielded power of its pre-stewardship fusion core. That raw power was the only reason they were still alive. Lena wasn't flying. She was brawling with physics, using the gravitational pull of planets and moons as a slingshot, skimming the edges of asteroid fields to mask their energy signature, and diving through the turbulent upper atmosphere of a gas giant to scramble their trail. These were the old ways, the chaotic, inefficient piloting techniques, the Weavers' perfect, predictable navigation systems had rendered obsolete. They were tricks learned from a time when space was not a sanitized highway, but a dangerous, untamed frontier. "The trace is active." Jian's voice crackled over the comms, his tone strained. He had jury-rigged a secure link, but the connection was tenuous. "The cartographer isn't just following us, it's predicting us. It's analyzing your flight patterns. Lena, it's learning the old ways faster than you can invent new ones. We can't outrun it." Alarms began to flash on Lena's console. "The scan did more than log our signature," she bit out, her eyes darting across the readouts. "It planted a parasitic query in the engine firmware. Every time I push the core, it sends out a microscopic data burst. It's a breadcrumb, a goddamn homing beacon." Eris felt a familiar wave of despair, cold and sharp. They had their ship, their symbol of freedom, and it was a leash, pulling the hunter directly to them. They were a ghost with a bell tied around its neck. "There has to be somewhere the Weavers don't look," Iris said, her mind racing through the thousands of archival maps she had studied. "Somewhere they've already cataloged and dismissed. Somewhere messy." Lena's head snapped up, a dangerous glint in her eye. "Messy," she repeated. "I know a place." She slammed a series of commands into the navigation panel, and the Nomad lurched violently, banking into a new trajectory. "Strap in," she warned. "We're taking out the trash." Their destination was a place that didn't officially exist on any Weaver star chart. It was designated simply as a high-density debris field, a navigational hazard to be avoided. But to the humans who lived before the stewardship, it had a name: the Graveyard of Ambition. It was a chaotic, orbiting junkyard of humanity's first failed attempts to reach the star's dead satellites, the fractured hulls of primitive colony ships, spent rocket stages, and the frozen, silent husks of early generation space stations. It was a monument to humanity's hubris and its relentless, clumsy reach for greatness. The Weavers had deemed it culturally insignificant refuse, a chaotic mess with no aesthetic value, and left it untouched. Navigating the graveyard was suicide for any automated pilot. The field was a three-dimensional storm of spinning, jagged metal. Lena, however, flew through it with the instinct of an animal in its native habitat. She danced the Nomad through the debris, using the sensor shadows of larger wrecks to hide their approach. The ship's hull screaming as smaller pieces of shrapnel scraped against its shields. "There," she said, pointing to a colossal, skeletal structure at the heart of the storm, the wreckage of the Icarus. Earth's first attempt at an interstellar arc, a ship that had broken apart before it ever left the solar system. It was a colossal failure, a tomb of forgotten dreams. And, apparently, it was inhabited. As they approached, a section of the Icarus's twisted hull slid open, revealing a makeshift docking bay lit by harsh, flickering work lights. "Unidentified vessel. You are trespassing on a sovereign salvage claim." A gravelly voice crackled over the open comm channel. "State your business or get acquainted with my magnetic grapples." "Silas, you old bastard. It's Lena." She transmitted back, a hint of a smile touching her lips for the first time since the raid. "Power down your junk magnets. I'm bringing guests." They docked with a shudder and a clang of metal on metal. The man who greeted them in the airlock was built like a piece of the machinery he salvaged. Silas was broad-shouldered and weathered, with a thick gray beard and hands calloused into something resembling stone. His eyes, however, were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. He looked from Lena to Eris, his gaze lingering on her clean, unscarred appearance with open suspicion. His home, which he called the Forge, was a chaotic masterpiece of repurposed technology. The central hub of the dead Ark had been transformed into a sprawling workshop, with scavenged engine parts, tangled nests of wiring, and holographic schematics flickering in the air. The place smelled of ozone, hot metal, and recycled air. "I heard a rumor a museum piece got loose," Silas said, his eyes fixed on the Nomad through a reinforced viewport. "Never thought I'd see the old girl fly again." "What did you do?" "Lena rob a graveyard. We need a place to lie low," Lena said, skipping the pleasantries. "And we need help. There's a Weaver parasite in the ship's firmware. It's broadcasting our position." Silas let out a low whistle. "Weaver tech. That's a different beast. Clean, elegant, and impossible to scrub without wiping the whole system. They don't build things to be repaired, they build them to be replaced." He turned his sharp eyes back to Eris. "And who are you? You don't have the look of a thief." "My name is Eris Thorne," she said. "We are resisting." Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Resisting lady, the war was over before it began. You're not resisting. You're a glitch in the system, and the system is about to run a diagnostic on your head. I make it a point not to get involved in the lost causes." "This ship is our only asset," Eris pressed. "And it's a liability as long as that trace is active. You know pre-stewardship tech better than anyone alive. Is there a way to remove it?" Silas walked over to a console, his fingers dancing over the keys. Pulling up the diagnostic Lena had run, he studied it for a long moment, stroking his beard. "There is no removing it," he said finally. "The parasite is woven into the core processes. It's like trying to take the salt out of seawater. But," he trailed off, a thoughtful look on his face, "you might be able to mask it. The Nomad's engine. It's a Mark IV cold fusion drive, unstable, inefficient, prone to radiation leaks. A beautiful mess. Its energy signature is so chaotic, so noisy, that if you could amplify that noise, you might be able to hide the parasite's whisper inside the engine's scream." "And how do we do that?" Lena asked. "You can't," Silas said with a grim finality. "The parts you'd need, the focusing coils and modulation regulators, they don't exist anymore. They were replaced by cleaner, more stable tech 50 years before the Weavers even showed up." He looked from the schematics to Eris, a shrewd, calculating light in his eyes. "This isn't just about hiding. You didn't steal a ship just to run. What's the real plan?" Before Eris could answer, Jean's voice cut in, frantic and distorted. "Eris, turn on a global feed. Any of them. Now." Silas flicked a switch, and a large holographic screen flickered to life, displaying the main Weaver-controlled news channel. The image was serene, a memorial plaza, bathed in soft light. A Weaver, its form radiating a gentle, sorrowful blue, stood before a crowd of silent humans. In the center of the plaza was a single, illuminated pedestal. On it sat Kyle's EMP grenade. We mourn the passing of a human of unique, if misguided, conviction. The Weaver's translated voice droned, a sound of perfect, synthetic empathy. In his final moments, archived for our understanding, he displayed a profound capacity for self-sacrifice, a core tenet of early human tribalism. We do not condemn. We seek only to comprehend. The broadcast showed a recreation of Kale's last stand, not as a desperate act of defiance, but as a tragic, pointless gesture. They had edited his final, defiant yell into a silent, mournful tableau. They had stolen his sacrifice and turned it into a piece of art for their collection, a cautionary tale about the futility of struggle. They called it the Requiem for a Resistor. It was the most brutally effective piece of propaganda Aris had ever witnessed. It wasn't an execution, it was an obituary, written by the ones who held the gun. The message was clear: resist, and your very memory will be curated into an exhibit of your own failure. They're not just hunting us, Eris whispered, a cold rage building within her. They're erasing us. She turned to Silas, her face pale but her eyes burning with a new, hard fire. You asked me what the plan is. The plan is to remind them that we are not artifacts. We are not a collection to be managed. The plan is to take their perfect, quiet gallery and burn it to the ground. Silas was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the screen where the Weaver was now explaining the cultural significance of Kale's final act. He looked at the faces in the broadcast's crowd, placid, accepting, their expressions as smooth and untroubled as the Weaver's encounter suits. Then he looked at Eris, at the raw, uncurated grief and fury in her eyes. Burning things requires a fuse, he said, his voice low. He shut off the broadcast and turned back to his console, pulling up a complex, three-dimensional map of the solar system's communication network. The Weavers control everything through a series of planetary hubs. All their data, their surveillance, Their drone commands it all flows through these nodes. They're heavily guarded, but they have a weakness. They were built on the foundations of our old comms network. They're new buildings on old fault lines. He pointed to a small, isolated relay station in a high-orbit trajectory over Mars. That's Relay 7. It's an older model, scheduled for decommissioning. Security is lighter there. Its data flow is minimal, but it's still connected to the core network. What are you suggesting? Eris asked. I'm suggesting, Silas said, a slow, wolfish grin spreading across his face, that you can't mask your engine's signature, but you might be able to build a ghost, a digital weapon, something that can ride their data streams from a place like Relay 7, something that looks and feels like a system error, but isn't. You want to be a poltergeist. You need to learn how to throw things on a galactic scale. He looked at the mountain of salvage tech that filled his workshop, the raw material of a forgotten age. I can't get you the parts to fix your engine, he said. But I think, with what I have here, I can build you a brand new fuse. Eris looked from Silas to Lena, and then to the vast, swirling chaos of the graveyard outside the viewport. They were fugitives, hiding in a junkyard, with a hunter on their trail and an empire turning their martyrs into museum pieces. But for the first time, they had a base, they had a forger, and they had a target. The quiet, lonely war of whispers was over. The time had come to learn how to build thunder. The forge became a crucible. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleeplessness, the scent of hot metal, and the constant, low hum of the Icarus's strained life support. There was no day or night in the graveyard, only the shifting shadows cast by the slow, silent ballet of spinning wreckage outside. Silas worked with a feverish, obsessive energy, his gruff exterior peeling away to reveal the meticulous artist beneath. He wasn't just building a weapon, he was resurrecting a dead philosophy of technology. Weaver tech was seamless, integrated, and disposable. Silas's creation, which he wryly christened the Cacophony Engine, was the opposite. It was a monstrous hybrid of scavenged parts, a chaotic assembly of pre-stewardship hardware bolted onto a stolen Weaver data processing core. It was ugly, temperamental, and, in theory, powerful enough to tear a hole in the Weaver's perfectly manicured digital world. While Silas forged the hardware, Aris and Gian worked on the software, the ghost that the engine would unleash. Jane, channeling his old gray hat instincts, focused on crafting a virus that mimicked a natural system decay, a digital phantom that would slowly and subtly corrupt data, not with a bang, but with a creeping, untraceable rot. He called it rust. Eris, however, had a different, more insidious task. She was building the poltergeist. Her weapon wasn't designed to destroy data, but to weaponize it. She delved back into the archives, into the darkest corners of human history she had helped the Weavers bury. She curated a payload of pure, uncut psychological horror, the last transmissions of dying soldiers, the frantic writings of people succumbing to plagues, the dissonant, screaming music of shattered minds, the philosophic texts that argued for the beautiful, terrifying chaos of free will. Her virus, which she named Echo, wasn't meant to break their systems. It was meant to break their sterile academic composure. It was designed to scream into the heart of their network, a raw, unfiltered broadcast of all the pain, rage, and messy. glorious imperfection they had tried to erase. Lena, grounded for the first time in her adult life, was a caged animal. She prowled the corridors of the forge, her restless energy a stark contrast to the focused stillness of the others. She couldn't contribute to the complex work of Silas or Eris, but she found her own purpose. She became their quartermaster, their scout. She took a small, nimble salvage skiff and began to explore the graveyard, mapping its currents, its hidden pockets, and its dangers. She returned with more than just knowledge. On one of her expeditions, she found another pocket of life within the wreckage, a small, isolated community of ghosts, families who had fled the stewardship years ago, choosing a perilous existence in the junkyard over a comfortable life in the gallery. They were scavengers, traders, and keepers of the old ways. They were suspicious and insular, but they recognized in Lena a kindred spirit. They became their first tentative allies, a small network of eyes and ears in the darkness. It was from one of these ghosts that Lena learned a critical piece of intelligence. The Weavers were not just hunting them with the cartographer. They were preparing a new curation initiative. They had identified the slow, subtle rise in cultural regression, the nostalgia and minor acts of defiance that Eris's first whispers had seeded, and had decided on a course of action. They were planning a global memory wipe, a gentle, targeted neurological intervention delivered through the public water supply and atmospheric processors. It wouldn't erase who people were, but it would trim the thorny branches of their collective memory, removing the ingrained cultural traumas and historical grievances that fueled dissent. It would leave them placid, content, and permanently severed from their own past. It was the ultimate act of archival. They were going to collect humanity's soul and leave the bodies behind. The news landed like a death blow. Their timeline had just been brutally cut short. The attack on Relay 7 was no longer a strategic objective. It was a desperate, last-ditch gamble to prevent a final, irreversible extinction of the human spirit. The plan was audacious and layered with a dozen potential points of failure. Lena, using her newfound knowledge of the graveyard's hidden pathways, would pilot the Nomad on a noisy run, using Silas's engine modifications to scream a chaotic energy signature, a deliberate feint designed to draw the cartographer's attention, while the hunter was focused on the bait, a smaller, stealthier ship. A salvaged ghost vessel called the Whisper would make the real run to Relay 7. On board would be Eris, Gian remotely jacked in from the forge, and a small, hand-picked team of ghosts, led by a hardened veteran named Riker. Their mission to physically board the relay, fight their way to its central transmitter, and manually install the cacophony engine. It was a suicide mission with a slim chance of success, but it was the only play they had. The night before the operation, the forge was quiet. Silas placed the finishing touches on the engine, a grotesque but beautiful sculpture of wires and scavenged metal. Lena stood in the cockpit of the Nomad, her hand resting on the throttle, her face a mask of grim determination. Eris found herself standing before a small, cracked mirror in her quarters. The woman looking back was a stranger, her face etched with exhaustion and a cold resolve that felt utterly alien. She remembered the academic who had passionately argued for surrender, who had believed in the Weaver's promise of a gentle hand. That woman was as much a museum piece as Kale's grenade. She had curated herself into a weapon. The operation began with a roar. The Nomad, its engine screaming with amplified energy, blasted out of the graveyard, a comet of pure, chaotic noise. As predicted, the response was immediate. 3 Weaver patrol vessels, sleek and silent as sharks, broke from their orbital positions and gave chase. And behind them, a single, unique energy signature, the cartographer, its focus absolute, its purpose singular. The hunt was on. Miles away, the Whisper slipped from the graveyard shadow, its hull painted a matte black, its systems running cold. They moved in silence, a true ghost in the machine. The journey to Relay 7 was a masterclass in tension. Every flicker of a sensor, every piece of passing debris, felt like a prelude to discovery. Riker and his team, 4 ghosts who had been born in the graveyard and knew no other life, were silent and professional. They checked their scavenged weapons pulse rifles that spat superheated plasma, EMP charges, and crude but effective kinetic shotguns with a calm familiarity that unnerved Eris. They were children of the wreckage, born into a war they didn't start but were grimly prepared to finish. They reached the relay undetected. It hung in the void, a delicate latticework of transmitters and cooling fins, a lonely spider in a vast, empty web. Docking was the first hurdle. The station had no external ports for a ship of their design. Riker solved the problem with a magnetic clamp and a plasma torch. They burned their way through the hull. The moment they breached the interior, the station came alive. Alarms, soft and melodic, chimed through the corridors. Interior defense drones, small, spherical cousins of the curators, detached from the walls and swarmed towards them. The fight was brutal and claustrophobic. The corridors were narrow, sterile, and white, quickly stained with scorched metal and the spatters of hydraulic fluid from destroyed drones. Riker's team moved with a brutal efficiency, using the tight confines to their advantage, creating choke points and ambushes. Eris, who had never held a weapon in her life, was armed with a pulse pistol and a terrifyingly clear purpose. She fired, her hands shaking, her shots missing more often than not, but she did not falter. She was no soldier, but she was a resistor, and that was enough. They fought their way to the central transmitter chamber, a spherical room dominated by a massive, glowing crystal that served as the relay's core. Here, the resistance stiffened. Weaver sentinels, bipedal constructs far more formidable than the drones, emerged from alcoves in the walls. They were not designed for killing, but for containment. Armed with projectors that fired nets of sticky, paralyzing energy, one of Riker's team was caught, his body instantly encased, his struggles futile. The Sentinels simply picked him up and placed him gently in a containment field, another specimen for the collection, while Riker and his remaining ghosts held off the Sentinels. Eris and Gian went to work. The cacophony engine was heavy and unwieldy. They had to physically interface it with the transmitter core, a delicate operation that required them to bypass layers of Weaver security. Gian, his consciousness a frantic blur of code in Aris's mind, fought the station's AI, a localized, less sophisticated version of the cartographer. "I'm in," he grunted, the strain evident even in his digital voice. "But the system is fighting back. It's trying to purge my access. Eris, you have to initiate the physical connection. Now." Eris, her hands slick with sweat, began to connect the engine's interface cables to the crystal's conduits. Sparks flew, and a jolt of energy threw her back against the wall. The crystal began to pulse with a malevolent red light. "It's not accepting the connection," she yelled. "The hardware is too alien from across the chamber." Riker shouted. "Then make it accept." He threw her a small circular object, an EMP charge. "It'll disable the Sentinel's local inhibitors for 3 seconds, but it will also fry every unsecured system in this room. Including your comm link to your friend, you'll be on your own." Aris looked at the charge, then at the pulsing red crystal. It was a choice. Break her last link to the outside, to Jian, to the Forge, and gamble that in the ensuing chaos, the connection would take or fail. She didn't hesitate. She armed the charge and threw it at the base of the crystal. The world dissolved into a silent, blinding flash of white light. Her comm went dead. The sentinels froze in place. The room's lights died, plunging them into a half-darkness lit only by the emergency strobes. And the cacophony engine, for the first time, came to life. A low, guttural hum filled the room, a sound of raw, ugly power that was the antithesis of everything Weaver. She had done it. They had planted the fuse. But as she looked at the dead comms, at the frozen sentinels, and heard the distant sound of more of them approaching, she realized the terrible truth. The Whisper was gone. Its systems fried by the EMP? They had their ghost in the machine, but the cost was their own escape. They were trapped on a dying station, deep in enemy territory, with an army of collectors on their way. They had thrown their rock, and now they had to face the avalanche. The silence that followed the EMP blast was a physical entity, a thick, ringing void where Jian's frantic voice had been. Eris was adrift, severed from her anchor. The cacophony engine was alive, its discordant hum a monstrous heartbeat in the gloom. But it was a feral, untamed thing. It had been designed for Jian to pilot remotely, to aim its payload of digital chaos at the heart of the Weaver's network. Now, it was just a bomb waiting for a signal that would never come. Riker and his 2 remaining ghosts were a whirlwind of grim activity. They scavenged weapons from the frozen sentinels, checked their own dwindling ammunition, and began barricading the doors to the transmitter chamber. Their movements were economical. Wasted words replaced by hand signals and the shared understanding of a lifetime spent in peril. "Station's on emergency power," Riker grunted, his voice echoing in the stark chamber. "Main comms are down, but they'll have a hard line back to their network. They know we're here. They just don't know what we've done yet. We have minutes, maybe less." "We have to activate it manually," Eris said, her voice sounding thin and reedy. She crawled towards the engine, her eyes scanning the complex interface she had helped design but never intended to operate. "I need to find a way to bypass Jian's remote handshake and trigger the payload release myself." It was a near impossible task. She was a linguist, a curator of ideas, not an engineer. Her knowledge was theoretical, abstract, but as she ran her hands over the warm, vibrating casing of the engine, she saw the logic beneath the chaos. She saw the patterns, the language of its construction. It was Silas's last testament, a story told in wires and salvaged chips. And she knew, with a sudden, chilling clarity, how to read it. Meanwhile, aboard the Nomad, Lena was dancing with death. The 3 Weaver patrol vessels were closing in, their movements a perfect, synchronized ballet of tactical precision. They weren't trying to destroy her, they were herding her, trying to box her in for the cartographer to make its final, analytical move. The cartographer itself hung back, a patient predator, its powerful scanners dissecting the nomad's chaotic energy signature, trying to find the signal within the noise. Silas's modifications were working, but they were taking a brutal toll on the old ship. The hull groaned under the strain, alarms flashed like strobing fireflies across the cockpit, and the air grew thick with the smell of burning ozone. "Come on, you beautiful bastard! Hold together!" Lena muttered, her teeth gritted, her entire being focused on the dance. She was no longer just a pilot. She was an extension of the ship, feeling its pain, anticipating its breaking points. From the forge, Silas and the remaining ghosts watched the two desperate battles unfold on their screens. They saw Lena's impossible, evasive maneuvers, and they saw the dead, silent icon where the whisper used to be. The silence from Relay 7 was a confirmation of their worst fears. "She can't hold them off forever," one of the ghosts said, his voice heavy. "And Eris, they're gone." Silas didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on a secondary screen, a complex diagnostic feed he had secretly hardwired into the cacophony engine. It was a failsafe, a last, desperate hope. The screen was dark, the connection severed by the EMP, but Silas did not look away. He just watched and waited. Back on Relay 7, the Weaver's response began. It was not an assault, it was a dissection. A new type of drone, spider-like and delicate, scuttled through the vents, their multifaceted lenses glowing with a cold, analytical light. They were not armed. They began to systematically disassemble the barricades, not with force, but with precise, molecular cutters that unwelded the metal without a sound. It was terrifying in its silent efficiency. They were not fighting a battle. They were decontaminating a laboratory. Riker and his team opened fire, their pulse rifles turning the first few drones into molten slag. But for every one they destroyed, 3 more took its place, their movements perfectly coordinated, their purpose relentless. "Eris, how much longer?" Riker yelled, slamming a fresh power cell into his rifle. "They're not trying to kill us. They're trying to get to the engine. I'm close," she responded, her fingers flying across a makeshift interface she had jury-rigged from a detached panel. The engine's internal logic was a labyrinth, but she was finding her way, following the threads of Silas's design. "I've bypassed the handshake protocol. I can trigger the primary function, the Rust virus. It will release into their network. It will start the decay." "That's not enough," Riker grunted, firing a blast that vaporized 3 drones in a single pulse. "They'll quarantine it. They'll cut this whole sector off from their network. We need the echo. We need the scream." Eris knew he was right. The Rust was a slow-acting poison. The echo was a heart attack. But to activate the echo, she needed to do something more. She had to sync her own mind to the engine. The payload was not just data. It was raw, curated human emotion. To unleash it, the engine needed a human catalyst, a ghost to give the machine a soul. It was a one-way trip. The neural feedback would be catastrophic. It would not just kill her, it would unravel her. Her consciousness shredded and broadcast across the network along with the payload. It was the final, ultimate act of curation. She would become the artifact. She looked at Riker, his face illuminated by the flash of his rifle. A man born of junk and defiance, fighting for a future he would never see. She looked at the memory of Gian, of Lena, of Kyle, of the countless, nameless faces she had helped condemn to this beautiful, placid hell. Her choice was not a choice at all. It was the period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Tell them I paid my debt, she whispered to no one, and slammed her hand down on the final conduit, opening the direct neural interface. Her world exploded. It was not pain, but a torrent of pure, undiluted information. She was the dying soldier, the plague victim, the mad composer, the defiant philosopher. She was a billion voices screaming at once, a symphony of rage, love, despair, and savage, indomitable hope. She became the echo aboard the Nomad. Lena saw it happen. Every screen in her cockpit simultaneously flashed with a single, stark image, a close-up of Eris's face, her eyes wide, tears streaming down her cheeks, a silent scream on her lips. It lasted for less than a second, and then every Weaver vessel, including the cartographer, simply stopped. Their engines died. Their lights flickered out. They drifted, dead and silent, in the void, in the forge. Silas saw the diagnostic screen flare to life. A tsunami of corrupted data pouring out from Relay 7, a signal of such raw, chaotic power that it overloaded his sensors. He saw the echo propagate through the Weaver network, not like a virus, but like a revelation. It didn't destroy their systems. It showed them a truth they had never been able to compute: the unquantifiable, terrifying, and beautiful chaos of the human soul. Across Earth, the effect was instantaneous and profound. The Weavers, from the highest echelons to the lowest patrol unit, froze. Their encounter suits locked, their veils of hard light dissolved, revealing for the first time the beings within frail, slender creatures with large, dark, uncomprehending eyes. They stood like statues in the streets of the cities they had curated, their minds overwhelmed by a storm of emotion they had no framework to process. They were academics who had accidentally mainlined the very chaos they had sought to catalog. They were broken. The global memory wipe ceased. The gentle hum of the stewardship fell silent, and for the first time in a generation, humanity was truly alone. The war ended not with a bang or a treaty, but with a profound, planet-wide silence. The Weavers did not leave. They were simply inert, monuments to their own intellectual arrogance, their minds shattered by a ghost. Humanity was free, but it was also fractured, waking from a long, comfortable dream into a world they no longer fully understood. The months that followed were a chaotic, uncertain rebirth. Lena, now a reluctant hero, used the Nomad to reconnect the scattered pockets of humanity, from the ghosts in the graveyard to the isolated communities on Earth. Silas became an architect of the new world, teaching a generation that had only known sterile perfection how to build, how to repair, how to fail and try again. The cacophony engine was never recovered, its last act a silent, eternal broadcast from a dead relay station, a memorial to its creator. Of Eris, nothing remained but the ghost. Her image became a symbol, her final, silent scream, the anthem of their liberation. They called her the first Echo, the woman who had sold the world and then bought it back with her own soul. Years later, an aging Lena stood with Silas on a ridge overlooking a new, chaotic, and vibrantly alive city, a place of mismatched architecture and loud, messy streets. It was imperfect, inefficient, and beautiful. "Do you think she knew," Lena asked, her voice quiet, "that it would work?" that they would just break. Silas looked out at the city, at the raw, untidy evidence of humanity's reclaimed spirit. She was a linguist, he said, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. She knew that some things don't need to be translated. They just need to be heard. In the end, the Weavers had been right. Humanity was a fascinating, broken artifact, but Eris Thorne, in her final, defiant act of counter-curation, had proven one simple, terrifying truth. Some artifacts refuse to stay in the gallery. Some artifacts scream,